days that begin like any other, but end up changing everything. For Gail, that day started in the quiet hallways of a hospital in São Paulo, with the smell of disinfectant thick in the air and a kind of fear that clings to the skin. He hadn't slept in 3 days. Not really. Maybe he dozed off now and then in the stiff chair beside his mother's bed. But real sleep, that felt like a memory. Room 204 on the 3rd floor, oncology wing, had become his world. The doctors spoke of aggressive treatment, like cancer was a beast to be beaten into submission. But Gail knew better. Some battles weren't won through force. Some you just endured. That morning, needing to breathe something other than recycled hospital air and dread, he stepped out. Told himself he was going for coffee. But really, he just needed a break from watching someone he loved fade a little more with every passing hour. That's when he heard it. Laughter. Real, uninhibited laughter. The kind only children know how to produce. It floated through the hallway like music from a distant party you weren't invited to. He stopped, turned his head, and saw her. She was kneeling on the floor in the pediatric wing, surrounded by children. Some in wheelchairs, some bald from chemo, all of them smiling. Her lab coat was bright and covered in hand-drawn cartoon characters. A plastic tiara sat crookedly on her head, and a cotton candy pink wig cascaded down to her shoulders. She held a book in her lap and was in the middle of a story. "A princess doesn't need a prince," she said, raising her voice just enough for the kids to hear clearly. "She needs courage." The kids clapped. A little girl, maybe 6, pale and fragile, raised her hand. "But what if the princess is scared?" The woman smiled then, and Gail felt that smile hit him right in the chest. "Being scared is okay, sweetheart. The problem is letting fear stop you." He hadn't moved, didn't know why he was still standing there. But something about her, about that moment, felt important. Then a nurse approached. "Sister Clara, you're needed in room 3. "Sister," Gail blinked. The woman in the tiara turned toward the voice, and her eyes met his. Just for a second. No smile, no wave. Just a look, like she recognized something in him. And for the first time in months, Gail felt like someone saw him. Not the grieving son, not the shadow of a man, but him. Back in room 204, his mother lay with her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The machines beeped their usual rhythm, a sound Gail had grown numb to. He sat in the same worn chair he always did, next to the woman who raised him, the woman who once could fix everything with just a hand on his head or a whispered word. "You okay, Filio?" she asked, her voice thin, raspy. "I'm fine," he lied. He hadn't been fine in months, since the diagnosis, since the long nights and impossible hope. His mother turned her head slowly toward him, eyes still shut. "Even with my eyes closed, I know when you're lying." That hit harder than he expected. There was something about her voice, about the way she said it, that made him want to fall apart right there. "You seem different," she added after a pause. "Like something inside you is lighter." Gail didn't know how to respond. How could he explain that a stranger's smile had cracked something open in him, that a woman in a flower tiara had reminded him what it felt like to be alive? He just squeezed her hand a little tighter and stayed quiet. That night, the hospital grew even quieter. Gail stepped out to eat something, though the truth was, food didn't appeal to him anymore. He wandered the hallway again, passing by the pediatric wing where the children's laughter had echoed earlier. It was empty now, still, but he stopped anyway, standing in the same spot where he'd seen her. Sister Clara, that's what the nurse had called her. A nun then, a woman who had made vows, who had given her life to something bigger than herself. He didn't know why he was thinking about her, but he was. He remembered the exact tilt of her smile, the color of the wig that didn't quite hide the weight in her expression, the way she'd looked at him, like she knew he was breaking and didn't need him to explain why. Gail shook his head, annoyed at himself. This was ridiculous. She was a nun, a stranger. But as he walked back toward his mother's room, a thought kept looping in his mind like a song he couldn't forget. She looked at me like she knew I was still alive. The following morning came with the same cold air, the same uncertainty, but something in Gail had shifted. He couldn't name it, didn't even try, but it was there. He found himself wandering toward the pediatric wing again, this time under the pretense of getting a coffee from the vending machine nearby. He didn't see her at first, just the nurses, some parents, a few volunteers. Then, through the glass window of the playroom, he spotted her. No wig today. Her real hair was short, simple, brown. She wore the same colorful coat, crouched beside a little boy with dark circles under his eyes, reading from a small, worn book. The boy laughed. Not a weak laugh, not a polite one, a real one. And Gale stood there behind the glass, watching them like he didn't belong in the world they occupied. He didn't know what was wrong with him, why he was lingering like some lost soul hoping to be found. But something about her, the way she moved, the way she leaned in close to listen when the boy spoke, like nothing else in the world mattered, made it impossible to look away. On Tuesday, she was painting with a girl in a wheelchair. The girl couldn't hold the brush properly, but Sister Clara guided her hand gently, patiently, letting her create messy strokes on paper. They laughed again, and Gale stood at the door, not entering, just watching, like always. He felt stupid, awkward. A grown man hiding outside a children's room, waiting for a woman he barely knew. But it didn't feel creepy. It felt necessary, like something inside him was healing just by being near her. One of the nurses caught him standing there. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, startling him. "The way the sisters work with the kids?" Gale nodded, unsure how to respond. "Sisters," the nurse repeated. The word hit him like a slap. Plural, meaning Clara wasn't just herself. She was part of something larger, something sacred. She had taken vows, lived in a convent, belonged to God. That night, Gale didn't see her, and he didn't sleep. Not because of fear for his mother's health, but because a part of him missed the sight of a woman who was never his to miss. By Wednesday, Gale was restless in a way he couldn't explain. He walked the hospital corridors without purpose, riding the elevator up and down like a man stuck between decisions he wasn't ready to make. He thought maybe seeing her again would help. Maybe it would give him clarity, or closure, or just something to hold on to. But she didn't appear. Not in the playroom, not in the hallway, not in the cafeteria where he now spent hours pretending to read magazines he never flipped through. And the strange part was, it wasn't disappointment that consumed him. It was something closer to loss. Like he'd been given a glimpse of something rare and hadn't realized how much he needed it until it disappeared. When he returned to his mother's room that evening, she was sitting upright by the window for the first time in days. Her face looked less puffy, her eyes more alert. "You really are different," she said out of nowhere, studying him with that maternal perception he could never escape. Anxious, but not in a bad way. Gale opened his mouth, closed it, and then shook his head. He couldn't lie. Not to her. Not when she was already fading. "Did you meet someone?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but direct. Gale froze. How did she always know? "No," he said too quickly. "I mean, not really." She smiled, slow and tired. "Love doesn't need time to be real. Sometimes it just needs a second." He didn't reply. Couldn't. He didn't even know what this was. This pull toward a woman he had spoken less than 10 words to. But when she looked at him in the hallway, he'd felt something shift. Something open. And no matter how much he tried to bury it under logic or tradition, it wouldn't go away. Later that night, unable to sit still, Gale wandered until he found the chapel. It was tucked away near the east wing of the hospital, a small room with wooden benches and a faint scent of candle wax. The door was open. Inside, one person knelt alone in the front pew. He knew it was her before he even saw her face. The posture, the curve of her shoulders, the stillness. It was Clara, but not Sister Clara in the playful wig or colorful coat. This was someone else. A woman in full habit, veil covering her hair, hands clasped tightly in prayer. And Gale, suddenly aware of how far apart their worlds were, stood frozen in the doorway, unsure if he was trespassing in something too sacred to touch. He stayed in the doorway watching her. The stillness of her body, the way her lips moved in silent prayer, the soft trembling of her hands. It was intimate in a way that made him feel like a thief for looking. Clara didn't see him at first. She was too deep in her world, in her conversation with a God he wasn't sure he believed in. But Gale felt something shift the moment she crossed herself and stood up slowly. Their eyes met. This time, it wasn't accidental. She saw him, really saw him, and her face changed. Not with a smile, not with shock, but with something that looked a lot like guilt, or maybe longing. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice lower than before, more solemn. "I didn't know anyone was here." Gale shook his head. "No, I'm the one who should apologize. I didn't mean to intrude." The silence between them was sharp, like both of them were listening for something that hadn't been said yet. She looked down, adjusting her veil with fingers that trembled slightly. "You're the son of the woman in 204, right?" she asked. He nodded. She already knew. She'd paid attention. That shouldn't have mattered, but it did. "She's doing better," he said, the words dry in his mouth. Clara nodded, offering a faint, sincere smile. "I'm glad." Then silence again. He wanted to say something else, anything, but his thoughts tangled up in the weight of her robe, the heaviness of his heart, the ache in her eyes. Finally he whispered, "You look sad." Her reaction was immediate. A quick swallow, a flicker of something across her face. "And you look lost," she replied. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Her words landed like a key fitting into a lock he didn't know existed. He stepped forward, just slightly, careful not to get too close. She didn't move away, but her body tensed. "I have to go," she said suddenly, her voice tight. He almost called out her name, but bit his tongue. She turned, walking quickly toward the exit, the swish of her habit echoing in the small chapel. Gale sat down on the last bench, alone again. He buried his face in his hands and whispered words that felt like confessions. "She's not just a woman," he murmured. "She's a woman I can't have." And he knew it then, in the silence that followed. This wasn't infatuation. It was something dangerous, something sacred, something he didn't know how to stop. The next morning, Gale found himself doing what he promised he wouldn't, lingering around the children's wing again, pretending to be on his way to get coffee or check messages on his phone. But really, he was waiting, hoping. He didn't even know what he expected, that she'd see him and come over, that they'd pick up where they left off in the chapel. It was ridiculous. She was a nun, a woman who belonged to another world, a world built on vows and sacrifice. But then he saw her, in the playroom again, helping a little girl paint butterflies with uneven brush strokes. Her habit was tucked under the same colorful coat, her hair hidden, her movements precise, gentle. Clara didn't notice him at first, but then she did. And in that brief moment when her eyes found his through the glass door, there was something neither of them could mask. Recognition, yearning. And then, just like that, she turned back to the girl, laughing softly at whatever the child had said. Gale stood frozen, a storm gathering inside him, torn between wanting to run and needing to stay. At home that night, the weight of it all pressed down like a suffocating blanket. The house was full, his father, his uncles, the whole extended family gathering like they always did when something important was coming. They filled the room with laughter and wine and the smell of roasted meat. Gale sat among them, but he wasn't really there. His mind kept returning to the chapel, to the way Clara looked at him, to the quiet strength in her voice when she said nothing at all. Then his father stood up, clinking a glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. "We have news," he said with a smile. "Gale's wedding is confirmed for October." The room erupted in cheers, claps, congratulations. Gale's stomach sank. He'd known this was coming. Promised since childhood to Zara Herrera, the perfect daughter of a powerful family. She was beautiful, poised, everything a Navarro heir was expected to marry. And she was a stranger to him. A stranger he was supposed to call his wife. "Think of your mother," his father whispered later, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "She deserves to see this happen." And Gale nodded. Because how could he explain that the only thing he could think about was a woman in a habit who read stories to dying children, and who had looked at him like he was more than just a name on a family tree. That night, Gale lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his room dark except for the glow of São Paulo's lights filtering through the window. The noise of the city hummed outside, cars, horns, life that didn't stop. But inside, he felt completely still, trapped. He thought about Zara, the way she always called at the same hour, the way her messages sounded like lines from a carefully planned script. She was everything his family wanted, everything tradition demanded, but not what he needed. His phone buzzed, vibrating across the nightstand. A message. "I can't wait for October. It's going to be beautiful. I love you." He stared at the screen, read it twice, then again, and felt nothing. Not anger, not affection, just a dull ache of inevitability. He set the phone down and walked to the window. Somewhere, out there in the sprawl of lights and traffic, was a woman who had sworn herself to something bigger, someone who couldn't, shouldn't be his. But he couldn't stop thinking about her. Not when he tried. Not even in the silence of the night when everything else faded away. At the hospital the next day, he walked with a purpose he didn't fully understand. Maybe it was to find her. Maybe it was just to breathe the same air. Either way, his feet took him to the garden behind the pediatric wing. A quiet space dotted with half-wilted roses and rusted benches. She was there, alone, sitting with her eyes closed, her veil tucked behind her shoulders. The sunlight hit her face just right. Soft, natural, unfiltered by fluorescent lights or hospital walls. She looked peaceful, human, and Gail realized something. She wasn't just Sister Clara anymore. Not to him. She was Clara, a woman, a mystery, a reason. She opened her eyes and saw him standing near the gate. Her expression shifted instantly. Shock, hesitation, something like fear. But she didn't run. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, stepping in. "You're not," she replied, but her voice betrayed her. He moved closer, stopping just short of sitting beside her. "May I?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." It was too quiet, too charged, like they were sitting on the edge of something neither of them could name. And Gail for once didn't speak. He just sat there beside the woman he wasn't supposed to love, breathing in roses and regret. They sat in silence for a long moment, both pretending to admire the struggling roses. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but heavy, full of thoughts neither dared speak aloud. Finally, he broke it. "Why roses?" he asked, his voice softer than he meant it to be. Clara didn't look at him right away. "Because they're beautiful, even when they're dying," she replied. Her fingers toyed with the cord at her waist, a small nervous gesture he recognized now. "Even with the thorns?" he asked. She nodded. "Especially with the thorns." Their eyes met then, and for a heartbeat too long, they didn't look away. Gail felt like he was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, of a truth that could unravel both of them. He wanted to ask her everything. Why she joined the convent, if she regretted it, if she believed in signs, if she felt what he felt. But instead he asked, "Why do you work with children?" Clara's eyes softened. "Because they need light, and because I know what it's like to grow up in the dark." That answer stayed with him, more than it should have. "And who brings you light?" he asked quietly, not as a challenge, but as something he truly wanted to understand. Clara looked down at her hands. "God," she said, but her voice wavered. It was the kind of answer you give when it used to be enough. Gail noticed, and it stung more than it should have. "And you?" she asked, flipping the question back on him. "What brings you light?" He thought of his mother's fading smile, of Zara's cold texts, of family meetings disguised as emotional traps. And then he thought of Clara in a pink wig, surrounded by laughter. "You," he said before he could stop himself. The word sat between them like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. Clara's breath caught, her body going still. "Gail," she whispered. "Don't." But her voice lacked certainty. It lacked protest. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just needed to say it." She stood up abruptly, brushing imaginary dust from her habit. "I have to go." He didn't stop her, just watched as she walked away, the distance between them growing with each step. But he didn't regret saying it, because for the first time in a long time, he had told the truth. That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed at the convent, staring at the ceiling, wide awake. The fan overhead hummed softly, the walls around her whispering the quiet prayers of other women who had made the same vows. She had said yes to this life 4 years ago, surrendering everything for a kind of peace she thought she needed. And it had worked, mostly, until now, until Gail. His words echoed in her mind. "You," not as a question, not as a plea, just a truth. And the worst part was, she hadn't been angry. She hadn't wanted to shut it down. She had wanted to sit there and let it bloom. That terrified her. She sat up, heart racing, and crossed the room to kneel at the small altar under the crucifix. She closed her eyes, hands clasped tightly. "Afasta de mí este cálice," she whispered. "Take this cup away from me." The words weren't hers, but they fit, because she didn't want this, didn't ask for this, and yet she couldn't stop it, couldn't stop thinking of the way he looked at her, like she wasn't hidden behind habits and vows, like she was still a woman. Across the city, Gail stared at the message on his phone from Zara. Dad wants to confirm the catering this week. Let me know when you're free." He hadn't answered. Not yet. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he did. He stood in the middle of his childhood bedroom, walls still decorated with posters from a life that didn't fit anymore. He had been raised to carry a name, a legacy, a set of expectations passed down like scripture. But lately, all he wanted was to break the pattern. Not out of rebellion, but out of need. He thought of Clara's trembling hands, her soft voice when she wasn't pretending to be stronger than she felt. The way her presence made the hospital feel less like a prison and more like a place where life still had meaning. He thought about the way she hadn't pulled away when their eyes met. The way she walked away, not because she didn't feel something, but because she did. And that made all the difference. Gale sat down on his bed and opened a blank message on his phone. He didn't type anything, just stared at the screen, torn between duty and the one person who made him feel like he was finally waking up. The next morning, Clara didn't go straight to the children's wing like she usually did. Instead, she found herself walking toward the hospital garden again, her steps slow, hesitant, as if her body moved on its own. The air was crisp, the roses still half wilted, leaning toward sunlight like they were trying to remember how to bloom. She sat on the same bench as before and removed her veil for a moment, not out of rebellion but just to feel the sun on her skin. A small, selfish act, a moment of breath, and then, as if summoned by some unspoken pull, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Gale stood at the entrance of the garden, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "You're not," she lied. Because he was. Because his presence undid her in ways she wasn't ready to admit. He walked closer, keeping his distance, respectful, but intent. "How's your mother?" she asked, her voice steady. "Better. Thank you." Silence. She looked at the flowers. He looked at her, both trying to pretend the world hadn't shifted beneath their feet. "Can I sit?" he asked. She should have said no. She should have stood up and walked away, but she didn't. "Okay." He sat at the other end of the bench, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel. Close enough to remember what it was like to belong nowhere, and yet feel seen. "The flowers are holding on," he said, glancing at the roses. It was a stupid comment. Small talk for a moment, too big. But Clara nodded. "They're strong." He looked at her then. Really looked. "So are you." Her breath caught just slightly. "Don't," she warned softly. But he didn't push. He just sat with her in the quiet. "Do you believe in signs?" he asked suddenly. Her eyes flicked to his, startled. "Why?" "Because I didn't plan any of this. Not you, not whatever this is." She didn't answer. Not right away. Because the truth was, she did believe in signs, in small miracles, in people showing up exactly when they weren't supposed to. "I didn't either," she finally said. "But here we are." And that was the closest either of them came to admitting how deeply they were already entangled in something neither of them had a name for. By the end of the week, something between them had shifted irreversibly. They hadn't touched. They hadn't even spoken much beyond carefully worded questions and answers. But their silences were louder than any conversation. Gale noticed the way Clara's eyes searched for him when she entered a room, the way her voice faltered when she sensed he was nearby. And Clara, she felt it in her chest, the way her breath tightened when she caught his silhouette by the glass, or the subtle warmth in her stomach when he smiled at a child. She hated it, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it wasn't allowed. It wasn't supposed to happen. But rules didn't stop feelings. Vows didn't erase humanity. She told herself she could manage it, keep her distance, keep her composure. But then came the day it all cracked. A child she was close to, Isabella, age 7, room 403, died. Clara had been there, holding her hand, whispering stories. She told the little girl it wouldn't hurt, that it would feel like falling asleep. But it had hurt, and Clara had seen it. The pain, the fear. And when Isabella took her last breath, Clara didn't pray. She just sat there holding her, shaking. She didn't know how long she stayed in that room. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But when she finally left, she didn't go to the convent. She didn't go to the chapel. She went to the far corridor, the one near the supply closet, and sat on the floor, her back against the cold wall, her face in her hands. And she cried. Not quietly. Not in the way nuns were taught to weep with dignity. She cried like someone who had broken, shattered by the weight of loving and losing. Gail found her there by accident, or maybe not by accident at all. He'd been roaming aimlessly, unable to stay still since his mother's last fever spike. He heard the sobs before he saw her. When he rounded the corner and saw Clara on the ground, the pain on her face almost dropped him to his knees. "Clara," he said, his voice a whisper. She looked up, startled, wiping her cheeks quickly like a child caught doing something forbidden. "I'm fine," she said, and it was the most obvious lie he'd ever heard. "Isabella," she choked. She's gone." And I told her it wouldn't hurt. Her voice broke, but it did. Gail didn't speak. What words could possibly mend what she was feeling? Instead, he did the only thing that felt right. He knelt down beside her, not touching, not invading, just there, and somehow that mattered. Clara turned her face toward the wall as if ashamed of her grief, but he saw the way her shoulders trembled. "You did what you could," he said quietly. "You were there. That matters." She shook her head. "I lied to her." Her voice cracked again. "I told her it wouldn't hurt, and it did." The guilt poured out of her like a wound that had been waiting to be opened. "You gave her comfort," Gail said, not trying to fix it, just telling the truth. "That's more than most people get." Clara leaned back, her head against the wall, her breath uneven. "I'm supposed to have faith. I'm supposed to believe that she's with God now, and that everything happens for a reason." She laughed then, bitter and broken. "But I don't. Not today." And Gail, who didn't believe in much of anything, felt something crack open inside him, because even in her despair, she was real, more real than anyone he'd ever known. He reached out, not thinking, not planning, and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Her fingers were cold, trembling, but she held on. It was the first time they had touched, skin to skin, and it felt like both salvation and sin. Clara closed her eyes, leaning her head just slightly in his direction, as if the weight of everything could only be carried if he helped hold it. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Neither should you," he replied. She turned her face toward him, eyes still glossy, cheeks flushed from crying. "What is this, Gail?" she asked. "Because it can't be what I think it is." He searched her face, memorizing every detail. "I don't know what it is," he said honestly, "but it feels like something I've been looking for my entire life." Her breath hitched, and for a terrifying second, he thought she might let go, walk away, but she didn't. Instead, she rested her forehead gently on his shoulder, just for a moment, one sacred, dangerous moment. And in that quiet corner of a hospital where lives ended and others began, two people who shouldn't have found each other sat together, bound not by words, but by a feeling that neither of them had permission to name. Clara didn't sleep that night, even after she returned to the convent, changed out of her hospital clothes, and knelt in front of the crucifix like she had done for years. She felt no peace, just noise, his voice, her heartbeat, the memory of that touch. Everything inside her trembled. She tried to pray, but no words came. Only guilt, only confusion. She could still feel the warmth of his hand in hers, still hear his voice saying she mattered. And worse, she had wanted to stay there, wanted to stay in that corridor forever, letting him hold her grief the way no one else ever had. Benedita noticed. Of course she did. She always did. At breakfast, the older nun cornered her in the kitchen, her voice calm but firm. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Clara mumbled something about a long night. Benedita watched her, those sharp eyes missing nothing. "Clara, what are you running from?" And just like that, the tears threatened to return. But she held them in, offered a practiced smile, and walked away. But deep down, she knew what she was running from, or rather, who she was running toward. Gail wasn't doing any better. He spent the morning avoiding Zara's calls, dodging questions from his father, and wandering the streets of São Paulo in a haze. His mind wouldn't stop replaying yesterday. Not just Clara's tears, but the way her body leaned into his, the way she hadn't let go. He told himself 100 reasons to stop thinking about her. She was a nun. She had vows. He had a fiancé. But none of those reasons could quiet what was happening inside him. The need to see her again was physical, like breathing, like hunger. He didn't care if it made sense. He didn't care if it ruined everything. All he knew was that she had looked at him like he mattered, not as a son, not as a Navarro, not as a man with responsibilities, but just as Gail. So he went back. Not to the garden, not to the cafeteria, to the chapel. He didn't expect her to be there, but somehow, deep down, he hoped she would be. And when he opened the door and saw her sitting alone in the front pew, her back straight, her hands clenched in prayer, he knew, whatever this was, it wasn't over. She didn't hear him come in, not at first. The chapel was dimly lit, the flickering of candles casting gentle shadows on the pale walls. Clara sat motionless, as if trying to hold herself together with silence alone. Gale paused in the doorway, unsure if he should approach. This was her world, not his. But something deeper than logic pushed him forward. His footsteps echoed softly on the tile, and she turned her head just slightly, as if she already knew it was him. "Clara," he said, his voice reverent, like he wasn't just saying her name, but asking for permission to speak it. She stood slowly, her face unreadable, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I needed to see you." She flinched, not because of the words, but because of how much they echoed her own desire. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This place, this space, it's not for this." Gale took a slow step closer. "Then tell me what this is, please." Clara's breath wavered. "It's temptation," she said. "It's wrong." Gale nodded. "Maybe, but it's real." She didn't move, didn't respond. He took another step. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. Not your faith, not your life. But I can't keep pretending like I don't feel what I feel." Her hands were trembling now, fists at her sides. "I've made vows," she said, and her voice cracked. "I made promises I meant." Gale stopped walking. He wasn't going to push her. He wasn't going to force something sacred into something selfish. "I know," he said, "but maybe you made them before you knew what else existed." That hit her, deep. She turned away, eyes closing against the tears forming again. "I can't," she whispered. "I don't know how to make this right." Gale stood in the quiet. Maybe it doesn't have to be right. Maybe it just has to be true. And in that stillness, filled with candles and memories and quiet prayers, Clara turned toward him. Not because she had the answers, but because she had finally stopped trying to silence the question. What if this, what if we, were meant to happen, even just once? Just as Gale stepped closer, as if the weight of the air between them could no longer be tolerated, a voice sliced through the stillness like a blade. "Never thought I'd find a sermon this interesting." Clara flinched. Gale turned. Zara stood at the entrance of the chapel, elegant and composed, but her smile was sharp, cold. Clara instinctively stepped back, as though the mere presence of this woman had yanked her from whatever truth she had been leaning into. "Zara," Gale breathed, the guilt already flooding his expression. "What are you doing here?" She walked in slowly, heels echoing through the chapel like accusations. "Your mother said you might be here. She didn't mention your company, though." Her eyes locked onto Clara's habit, her veil, her posture. "Sister Clara, was it?" she asked sweetly, as if savoring the title like poison on her tongue. Clara tried to find words, but her throat had closed. "She works with the children," Gale said, voice low, almost protective. "Of course she does," Zara replied, eyes never leaving Clara's. "Must be fulfilling. Healing even." She took a step closer. "And how long have you been healing my fiancé?" Clara couldn't answer. Everything inside her froze. She had been seen, exposed. Not just by anyone, but by the woman Gale was supposed to marry. Zara turned her gaze back to Gale, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "We have dinner with my father, remember?" she said, like this interruption hadn't happened. Gale hesitated, looked at Clara. She wouldn't meet his eyes now. Couldn't. "Let's go," Zara said, her tone final. And Gale moved, not because he wanted to, but because in that moment, choice was too heavy. Clara stood frozen as they walked out together, Zara's hand curled around his arm like a chain. At the door, Zara looked back one last time. "It was a pleasure meeting you, sister," she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "I hope your prayers protect you from what's coming." The door closed behind them. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful this time. It was the kind of silence that follows disaster. Clara sat down slowly in the pew, shaking, and for the first time in years she didn't try to pray. She just wept, not because of what had happened, but because of what it had made her feel. Helpless, heartbroken, and human. Zara didn't speak in the car, not at first. She sat with her legs crossed and her arms folded, staring out the window as the city flickered by. Gale gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white from tension. He could feel her silence like a blade against his skin, sharp, deliberate. Finally, she spoke. "She's pretty," she said, still watching the lights outside. He didn't answer. In a soft, simple kind of way. Her tone was calm, almost casual, but Gale knew better. He knew the storm was only beginning. "Are you sleeping with her?" she asked, not turning to face him. "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "But you want to," she added, more as a statement than a question. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Zara turned her head, finally looking at him. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked. "It's not that you're falling for someone else. It's that you thought I wouldn't notice." Her voice trembled slightly now, the veneer cracking just a little. "You think I don't see the way you disappear lately? How you're barely here even when you're right beside me?" Gale kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Zara laughed, a single bitter sound. "That's the thing about betrayal, Gale. No one ever means for it to happen." The rest of the drive was silent. When they arrived at her father's apartment building, she opened the car door but paused before stepping out. "Whatever this is," she said, "make a choice, her or me, because I won't wait around while you decide whether I'm worth it." And with that, she left, heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks. Gale didn't follow. He sat there staring at the dashboard, the echo of her words rattling inside him. Make a choice. As if it were that simple. As if hearts listened to rules. As if love cared about what made sense. He closed his eyes and saw Clara, on the hospital floor, in the garden, in the chapel. Not a fantasy, not a temptation. Just her. And suddenly, the thought of pretending, of returning to the life that had been carved out for him, felt unbearable. He didn't know what the future looked like, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't lie to himself anymore. Clara sat alone in the chapel long after Zara and Gale were gone. The silence around her felt thicker than ever, not sacred, but suffocating. She had faced judgment before, in whispers, in looks, but never like that. Never so direct, so sharp, so humiliating. Zara hadn't needed to yell. Her words were precise, calculated. Clara had been stripped bare in just a few lines. And worse, she hadn't defended herself. Because there was no defense. Not when the guilt was already eating her from the inside. She had broken nothing in deed, but everything in spirit. Her vows, her peace, her belief that she was safe behind the walls of her devotion. Cracked. Clara lowered her head into her hands, trembling. "Forgive me," she whispered to no one and everyone. But it wasn't forgiveness she needed most. It was clarity. She left the chapel only when the hospital closed its doors for the night, her body aching from stillness, her chest hollow. She walked home through the quiet streets of São Paulo, her habit clinging to her legs in the cold wind, feeling less like a symbol of faith and more like a disguise. She didn't sleep that night either. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her eyes dry but her soul screaming. In the morning, as the convent buzzed with routine prayers and shared duties, she moved through it all like a ghost. She spilled the tea she was pouring, dropped her rosary once, forgot the lines of a prayer during chapel. Sister Benedita pulled her aside. "We need to talk," she said softly. Clara followed her to a small office behind the library. The door clicked shut. "The Mother Superior knows," Benedita said. Clara didn't ask what she meant. She already knew. "She's given you a choice. Immediate reassignment to a cloistered convent, no outside contact, or temporary leave from your vows." Clara stared at her, heartbeat thudding. "Clausura?" she asked, barely breathing. Benedita nodded. "Yes, a life of silence, solitude, reflection." Clara's legs felt weak. "And the other option?" "Time to think," Benedita said. "Time to figure out who you really are." Clara didn't answer. Couldn't, because she already knew. And yet knowing wasn't the same as choosing. "You have until tomorrow," Benedita added gently. "But Clara, whatever you decide with courage." The door closed quietly behind her, but the sound of her entire life unraveling was deafening. Gale didn't wait until tomorrow. The moment he left Zara at her father's, he knew there was no returning to the life he'd been dragging behind him. He went home, sat across from his own father, and for the first time, told the truth. "I'm not marrying Zara," he said simply. Adriano Navarro stared at him, silent at first, as if the words hadn't registered. When they did, the silence shattered into fury. "You think this is a game?" he growled. "This family has given you everything. You don't throw that away over some... He couldn't finish the sentence. Gail didn't flinch. "I'm not in love with her. I never was." His father slammed his hand on the table. "You have a duty. You owe this family your name, your future." Gail stood. "I owe myself the truth. I owe myself a life that's mine." The shouting match lasted longer than it should have. At some point, Zara's father joined the conversation over the phone. Threats were made, promises were broken, but Gail didn't back down. When it was over, he walked out of the house with nothing but his phone, his wallet, and a conviction that for once he had made the right decision, even if it cost him everything. He didn't go to Clara right away. Something told him she needed space, needed time to face her own fire. Instead, he drove through the city aimlessly, windows down, letting the air cool the adrenaline that still burned in his veins. He parked near the hospital around midnight, staring up at the building where everything had changed. He thought of his mother, her smile, her strength, the way she'd looked at Clara that day, almost as if she understood everything before either of them did. He had lost her, but she had left him with a gift: clarity, permission, love. As dawn approached, he opened his phone and typed a message. "I did it. I'm free. I don't know what comes next, but I know I want it to be with you." He didn't hit send. Not yet. He just stared at the words, letting them sit there, heavy and real. Because love wasn't just a feeling, it was a decision, a leap, and he was already midair, hoping to find her waiting on the other side of the fall. Clara didn't sleep that night either. She stayed up in her small cell at the convent, a suitcase on her bed, her Bible in her lap, and a single letter she couldn't bring herself to read again. It was from her parents, worried, confused, but not unkind. Her mother had written it in delicate handwriting, with phrases like, "We only want your happiness," and "God sees all, even the battles we don't talk about." Her father hadn't written much, but there was one line that stuck with her. "If you need to come home, the door's still open." Home. The word echoed strangely inside her. She hadn't called it that in years. The convent had been her home now, but it no longer felt like one. The walls were familiar but hollow, like the echo of something she used to believe in. And when she closed her eyes, all she saw was Gail's face, his voice, the way he looked at her when she said nothing at all. She opened her suitcase, placed her few belongings inside: simple clothes, her rosary, the childhood Bible from her first communion, and then she folded her habit neatly and left it on the bed. She didn't cry, not then. Her hands trembled, but her heart felt calm, scared, but calm, because for the first time in 4 years, she wasn't hiding. She left before sunrise, moving through the convent like a ghost. She didn't wake anyone, didn't write a farewell, just walked through the hallways one last time, touched the wall outside the chapel where she used to kneel, and whispered, "Thank you." At the front gate, the sister on duty barely looked up. Clara passed through like any visitor, no longer belonging. Outside, São Paulo was still waking up. Streetlights flickered, cars began their endless dance, and Clara stood on the sidewalk like someone reborn. She didn't know where to go yet, only that she couldn't go back. She took out her phone, opened her messages, and stared at Gail's name. Her fingers hovered above the screen. Then, with a breath that felt like a first, she typed, "I left. If you still want to find me, I'm ready." She hit send before she could think twice. There was no lightning, no revelation, just a small vibration and a quiet rush in her chest. Then she started walking. No destination, no plan. Just forward. Just toward whatever this new life might look like. And deep down, she hoped that wherever Gail was, he was already on his way. Gail's phone vibrated as he sat parked outside the hospital, the sky still soft with early morning light. He didn't expect anything. His last message hadn't been sent. He hadn't dared. But when he saw Clara's name on the screen, his heart stopped. "I left. If you still want to find me, I'm ready." That was it. No explanation, no hesitation, just truth. He stared at the words for a second, then smiled. Not wide, not loud, just enough to feel it in his chest. He threw the car into drive and peeled out of the parking lot, his mind racing faster than the city around him. There was no address, no location. But somehow he knew exactly where she would be. He didn't question it, just followed instinct. And there she was, sitting on a bench near the small park across from the children's wing, her suitcase at her feet, hair uncovered, face calm but pale. She looked up when he stopped the car and stepped out. Their eyes met. No one spoke, not at first. Then he walked toward her, heart pounding like a drum. "You really did it," he said. She nodded. "So did you." He sat beside her, their knees almost touching, their silence thick with 1,000 words they didn't need to say. "I didn't know if you'd come," she whispered. "I was already coming," he replied, "even before I got your message." She looked down, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing shallow. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "So am I. We don't know what we're doing." "No," he agreed, "but we're doing it anyway." Clara turned to him then, her eyes glossy but steady. "Why?" He didn't pause. "Because I'd rather face the unknown with you than live a life that was never mine." She exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for years. Gail reached out, took her hand. No hesitation this time, no trembling, just warmth, just certainty. "Whatever happens next," he said, "we face it together." She squeezed his fingers, and there, on that bench where neither of them had planned to be, between the echoes of old vows and the hush of a new beginning, Clara leaned into Gail's shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, let herself believe in the future. Months passed, but the memory of that morning never faded. Clara and Gail didn't move fast. They didn't fall into each other like stories often suggest. Instead, they built something carefully, deliberately. Clara took a small apartment near the hospital, began working as a counselor for grieving families. Gail stepped away from the family business and opened a non-profit that helped children access medical treatment. They saw each other often, but without the rush, without the pressure to define what was already unfolding. There were hard days, days where Clara questioned everything, where old guilt returned like shadows in the night, days where Gail wrestled with loneliness, with anger toward a family who now saw him as a traitor. But in those moments, they found each other again, in small gestures, in quiet coffees before sunrise, in shared walks through the hospital gardens. And slowly, gently, what they had became more than the flame that sparked in a chapel or a whisper in a hallway. It became a life, a new one neither of them had expected, but both had chosen. On the 1-year anniversary of Clara leaving the convent, they returned to the same chapel, now empty, unused, a relic of the past. She wore a simple dress. He wore the same quiet smile. They lit a candle, said no vows, and spoke no grand words. But as they stood side by side, hands clasped, they both knew this was their altar now. Not a place built from tradition, but from truth, from pain and hope and the courage to walk away from everything they thought they owed the world. Clara looked at him, her eyes softer than ever. "We didn't fall from grace," she said. "We stepped into it." And Gail kissed her, gently, reverently, not as a man claiming victory, but as a soul finding peace. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the miracle that had just unfolded inside a forgotten chapel. But for Clara and Gail, the world had never been more still. And in that stillness, they found what so many search for and so few truly reach. Not just love, but freedom.